Humboldt Martens. We're really excited to have Keith here. When I was an undergrad, I moved to Arcata. I remember seeing these posts about bar-tailed godwit in the mouth of the Mad River, and it was a hot birder, Keith Slauson, and I said, oh, this guy's really tearing it up. And then I started doing some data entry at Redwood Sciences Lab and started hearing about this great Humboldt Marten work by a guy, Keith Slauson. What are the chances? There's two biologists, one who studies birds, one who studies martens, but sure enough, it's the same guy. So he wears lots of different hats, an ecologist with a wide breadth. He got his undergrad at HSU, went on to do a master's at OSU, Oregon State University, and now is completing his PhD at the University of Montana. He's a research ecologist at Redwood Sciences Lab as well, and I recently found out he's also teaching a class at Humboldt State University. So he's a birder, a mammologist, and wears lots of different caps, and we're happy to have him teach us about the Humboldt Marten today. Thank you, Keith.
Thanks, Jared. Well, thanks for giving me the opportunity to share with you some work that I've been involved in for about 15 years now, and really a rising conservation issue here in coastal California and soon to be in coastal Oregon as well. The general outline for presentation, I'm going to cover 6 broad areas, teach you a little bit about Marten morphology and energetics, cover the historical distribution and the current status of Humboldt Marten in California. Talk a bit about what these guys eat and how they forage and find food, and then really get into what's driving the conservation situation that we find in Humboldt Marten today, landscape modification, mostly forest modification. And then what we're doing with the Humboldt Marten Conservation Group to kind of turn this around. How are we going to get the marten restored to a much greater portion of its historical range and increase its population size? So first, for those of you that are familiar with a lot of our members of the Mustelids here in Northwestern California, we have a variety of species that are all kind of similar in their long and narrow shape with long tails. We have mink and river otter in our aquatic systems. The mink is actually quite similar looking to a marten, but tend to be more blackish or brown in color with a reduced kind of white throat patch. Small ears, and are almost always on the margins of lakes, ponds, or rivers. And then in the forest, we have the much larger and typically darker looking fisher, which is also a conservation concern in Pacific states. Fishers often look black, although their pelage is actually dark brown. And compared to a marten, they tend to have more rounded ears, much longer tail proportional to their body length. And martens have those nice big triangular ears, tend to have some yellowish coloration in the throat into the chest and gular area. And then one of our most widespread generalists of that group is the long-tailed weasel, which you can find in dune systems, grasslands, forests, at the marsh. Also looks kind of marten-like, but it tends to be much smaller with mostly rounded ears, a very kind of narrow, sparsely furred tail compared to the big bushy tail of the marten. So martens are about 500 to 680 millimeters. That's about the length of your fist to your elbow. And then their tail sticks out a bit farther, so a pretty lean little guy. They weigh just a couple pounds, or half a kilogram to 1.5 kilograms. They're sexually dimorphic. The males are about 40% larger than the females. And they exhibit a polygamous mating system, with females solely responsible for the raising of young. For a pretty small animal, they take a while to start reproducing. Females typically don't give birth to their first litters until they're at least 2 years old, and they usually only have 2 to 3 kits per litter annually after that. And most individuals in the wild do pretty good if they get up to 5. So thinking of how populations persist, survival is going to be pretty important here. If you only live 5 years and you're a female, you may only have 2 to 3 years where you can produce young and contribute those to the population. And we'll see how that becomes important later on. And martens are really eating machines. That long, narrow body shape is not really good for conserving energy. They give off a lot of heat when they're moving, especially in the winter when they get soaked running around through the wet foliage. So they need to keep feeding in order to maintain their body mass. They have little capacity to naturally store fat, so they can't add a bunch, so they have to go out every other day or every day to feed, and can spend, don't tend to take a lot of breaks and hole up during the winter. They're kind of out almost every day. And some work done to look at how much energy they need on average, comparing autumn to winter, found that they need about 179 grams in the fall more than in the winter, a little bit less. And what that equates to, if we were to say how many bulls or squirrels, that's quite a few individual redback bulls per day to meet your energy needs. 5 to 7, or almost a whole Douglas squirrel in the fall, or a half in the winter. And that may not sound like a lot, but if I were a marten, that sort of proportion of fresh prey to body mass would require me to eat about 18 pounds of prey a day. So that's a lot of food. So these guys are constantly foraging, and they need a lot of food to maintain themselves.
Keith,
Yeah, question?
could you talk about why they need more food in the autumn than the winter?
Yeah, in the winter they tend to reduce the amount of time they're foraging because it's more energetically costly, because it's cooler out, they tend to get more wet, they're going to lose a lot more energy foraging. They also shift the prey they select to larger bodied animals in the winter. So those are two strategies to kind of minimize your energy loss. Be active less, hunt bigger things. In California, we have a great historical benchmark for the distribution of mammals as well as birds from Joseph Cannell and his colleagues. And if you were to look up the section for the Humboldt Marten, or actually Martens in general in California, he outlined the distribution of verifiable records for the Sierra subspecies, kind of all along the Sierra Nevada mountains, the Southern Cascades, and over into the high Trinity Alp, Marble Mountain, and Salmon Mountain complexes. And then along the coast was the historical range of the Humboldt Marten from northwest Sonoma County all the way up to the Oregon border. And only going about as far inland as about 20 kilometers, or sort of the edge of the fog influence. So he really defined the historical range of the Humboldt Marten as the narrow, humid coastal strip, redwood and Douglas fir forests that tend to be fog influenced.
What was the date for that?
The book was published in 1927, but most of the records come from the late 1800s and early 1900s. So a good, 100 years ago. And the original basis for splitting or deciding there's two subspecies of martens in California were based on morphological differences on the pelage. If you look at the Sierra Marten on the right there, you can see that they have a much more extensive gular coloration going far into the chest. It's filled up most of the throat. And the Humboldt Marten samples, one of the key characteristics for pelages was a much reduced throat pattern and very, very blotchy. There's also a number of skull morphometrics that are different, shorter rostrums, different spacing between the teeth, and those were the basis for splitting them historically. Now, when most people think about martens and talk about them, they tend to think of them as stored way up high in the snow zone, in the red fur and the true fur. And that's where most of the distribution of the Sierra subspecies is. Typically above 4,000 feet, can go above tree line in places. But really those high elevation true fir forests is kind of the, where most of the distribution of that subspecies is. And again, that subspecies can go outside of forests into talus areas to hunt things such as pikas and yellow-bellied marmots in the summertime. And then I already said a little bit about the description of where the Humboldt Marten occurred, the narrow northwest humid coastal strip from near sea level to about 3,000 feet. So really low elevation forest here on the coast. And then this is a poignant quote from that book. All trappers agree martens are found mostly on the high ridges, making the trapping of them difficult as the climb in winter is heartbreaking, owing to a wet tangle of brush and down timber higher than one's head. And if we were to go on a hike in marten habitat, we'd all be moving shrubs to get around and climbing through that dense thicket, and you'll see some images of what that looks like. Well, the Humboldt Marten was feared extinct as recently as the mid-1990s because this was the last known verifiable evidence of Humboldt Martens at that time. This guy, Jim Height up in Smith River, this is a pelt that his dad trapped in the headwaters of Rowdy Creek. And at that time, it was thought that we've done tons of surveys, we haven't found them, and they might be extinct. And that prompted Bill Zielinski and Rick Golightly to write this paper, summarize all the information and evidence that we couldn't find any or they might be extinct, and they presented that at the Redwood Coast Ecology Conference. Well, I was working for Bill at that time and actually was in the audience with this track here, which we got doing some fisher surveys out a little ways from Orleans. And that was the first verifiable evidence that martens still persisted. And then soon after that, we started doing surveys in the vicinity and established that there was in fact at least one remnant population. And that's what we know of today in California. And that was in 1996, so pretty recent rediscovery.
So is that a fairly typical way to see a marten climbing a tree trunk?
Well, if you look right here, we put some chicken in a wire basket. But they are very arboreal, and they can hunt flying squirrels and Douglas squirrels up into the trees. They climb trees probably most days when they're foraging, and they climb up into trees to find resting locations, which I'll talk about a bit. Very easily traveling up and down the trees and so forth. So, as you might imagine, a lot has changed since the late 1800s in terms of the condition of our forests here on the North Coast. If you look at most of the range of the Humboldt Marten, it does have a lot of redwood forest here in green, but it has a lot of other forest types, coastal Sitka spruce, coastal Douglas fir. And if we look at historical accounts of what those forests look like, the Wieslander data set is a great one. This was an individual who rode around California on horseback and basically mapped out sort of the distribution of different forest types and then sort of what age classes they were in. And it's not a great image, but if you look at these straight line hash marks, all of that is the oldest stage of forest conditions, old growth essentially. So most of the historical range of the Humboldt Marten was dominated by old growth redwood, Douglas fir, Sitka spruce forests prior to the onset of logging. And I'm sure you're all familiar with the fact that a lot of that forest is now gone. This image here is the depiction of what's left in terms of old growth redwood. Those little red spots, those small red patches are pretty much what's left. Not much substantial in Mendocino County or Sonoma anymore. This is Humboldt Redwood State Park headwaters, and this is Redwood National State Parks, and that's Jedediah Smith up there. So quite a change from what's been there in the past. And when we look at the distribution of animals within their historical ranges from Joseph Grinnell's work, we compare that to where we've surveyed. These are all the survey locations that have occurred in the last 20 years or so throughout both the Sierra and Humboldt subspecies in California. And we see where the current distributions are today. We have just that one single population here. The Sierra subspecies is doing a lot better. It's still fairly well distributed throughout most of its range, although there's been some minor contractions in the north. So as far as we know right now, we've conducted more than, probably now closer to 4,000 survey locations, probably more than 70,000 survey nights. There appears to be just one single remnant population really in the north end of the range. And in 2008, we estimated that there were less than 100 individuals. We resurveyed in 2012. We think the numbers have gone up a bit, but they're nowhere near even 100 at this point. So that's a pretty small number of animals in the population. And then this prompted both an internal and external petition for listing the Humboldt Marten subspecies under the Endangered Species Act at the federal level, and that is soon to be decided upon, probably within the next year. So let's transition now into talking a bit more about what's the ecology of these guys, what do they eat, what sort of habitat structures do they need, and then we can kind of move into some of the challenges conservation-wise for these guys and what's actually still going on that's holding them back from rebounding on their own. So we've done some diet work with these guys. This is the results of cleaning up about 400 scats from the Humboldt Marten population. We find that they eat a lot of fruit. They do take some insects, but they're really, mammal specialists. They do eat some lizards and birds. They do take quite a few Steller's jays, which some people may be happy about. And surprisingly, most of the lizards they eat are northern alligator lizards. And then the insects they take, they really raid ground nesting bald-faced hornets and yellow jackets, just like bears do. So that's pretty interesting. So let's take a look into a couple of these groups, mammals and berries. Starting with the fruit, there's really just a couple of species that show up. It's salal, black huckleberry, or some people know it as evergreen huckleberry, California red huckleberry, and they do eat some manzanita. And those first three species are also dominant shrub species in the understory of the places that the Humboldt Marten lives. And as you probably know, fruit's not, if you need a lot of energy, fruit can give you some water and some sugar, but it's not really going to sustain you. What really sustains these guys are eating small mammals. And they eat quite a few species, but some of the really key ones are the redback vole. And in the summer and into the fall, they really hammer chipmunks pretty good. But chipmunks go away in the wintertime, so they tend to shift. This diet work was done mostly in the summer and fall. But across other diet studies, the chipmunks go away, and then they shift more to flying squirrels and Douglas squirrels in the winter. So we would expect that same shift here if we had diet samples that went into the winter and early spring. And we kind of identified 4 main spatial scales that martens select habitat to meet their different life history needs. The first is at the microscale. These are specific structures that martens use on a daily basis for resting or in the breeding season for denning. So this young female on a cool October morning decided to get on top of this very large diameter broken off snag and sleep in the sun. That's one of her resting locations. And that keeps her elevated off the ground and safe from predators while she's sleeping. Martens also forage at specific locations. We don't have a lot of snow here, but this just illustrates that this marten goes to the edge of this log and then looks down into that hole to see if there's a vole or a Douglas squirrel that's using that runway. And martens tend to focus a lot on large down logs to find prey. They tend to also select stands that have a lot of these types of structures in them. Older stands tend to have more large diameter logs, snags, and so forth. So those stands that have lots of those features tend to be used more than those that are decooperative those things. And then at the home range scale, they select a part of the landscape that has a high proportion of high value habitat. And in this image, here's a breeding female. This is sort of the edge of her home range, and you can see that she's placed her home range to have mostly old growth habitat. And then this lighter stringer here is a bit of riparian. So that's probably going to be a pretty productive habitat if you're feeding on things like flying squirrels, Douglas squirrels, redback voles, and a variety of other things. And then finally, as every year, right about now actually, the young martens are getting ready to disperse from their mothers. And when they do, they have to move through the landscape making choices on where to go to find prey and avoid predators. And that's what we think of for this landscape scale selection. As they move through, they're making choices on where to go and where not to go. And then when they find a place that looks good, that's unoccupied by another marten, they'll select and establish a home range. So why are resting locations important, and what are they? I talked a little bit about that. But every day in between their foraging bouts, these animals need to find a safe place, maybe to catch their prey and eat it, or also take a nap and conserve energy and not get predated while they're doing it. So they tend to select places that will provide refugia from predators. So again, if you're elevated from the ground, you're going to be safe from a lot of ground-based mammalian predators. Also, refugia from temperature extremes. So in the winter, if you go out and forage and you get completely soaked, you probably want to find a place that's, one, dry, two, can sort of keep you warm so it's insulated, something that has a little more density from thermal protection from the environment, and then a place that you can dry off. And of course, you wouldn't pick the top of a broken off snag if it were raining out. You would find probably a hollow cavity or a hollow log on the ground. And sometimes when these animals take particularly large prey, they don't eat it all, so they need to have a safe place to take it and cache it for later when they'll continue eating it again. So martens usually pick large cavities in live or dead trees, chambers which are produced when multiple logs fall together and produce an inner chamber. Platforms like you saw, a broken top snag provides a platform, sometimes large limbs in the summertime. And in places where there is snow, they can rest under the snow. They also use live trees, snags, and logs really dominate the structures that they select. More than 80% of the resting structures we found the Humboldt Marten using are those three structure types. And this is what these things look like. It could be a cavity in a live tree created by something like a pileated woodpecker or northern flicker or a natural rot. The broken top platform. And then often these inner rotted out logs provide good structures on the ground to get into. And then this is an example of what a chamber is, falling down in a place that provides a nice interstitial area that's safe from predators. They also use other things like root wads, when trees blow over and tip up. There's often little spaces in there. They can use rock piles in serpentine areas where they're available. And they do make some use of slash piles that are produced from forced harvest activities. All right, and another concept that's important for marten foraging is the presence of complex physical structure near the ground. And that enables them to sneak up on prey before they're detected and catch them. So for marten, a lot of this means those larger sort of down logs, rock piles, shrub cover. And in studies where they've compared stand types that have a lot of this physical complexity near the forest floor and those that don't, Andreski was one of those, they find that prey encounters, attacks, and kills were reduced in log stands with reduced coarse woody debris, but similar gold densities. And that redback bulls and log stands with reduced coarse woody debris also had increased wariness. So there's a couple things going on there. They're able to detect and see the martens at a much farther distance, which means the marten's going to have a harder time catching them. So that complex structure is important for their predation success. And at the stand scale, there's a couple of important things. The first, for the Humboldt Marten, which is a little bit unique for martens in general, is the importance of that dense shrub cover. That was one of the most influential variables when we did this habitat selection work. The other thing was seral stage, and if you look at the 6 seral stages here from shrub pole, early mature, mid-mature, to late mature, almost all of those younger stands types were selected against. You see the white bars, much smaller proportion than the black bars. That suggests selection against. They use late mature kind of in proportion availability, but if you look at the old growth comparison, the black is availability, the white is how much they use those. They use those 4 or 5 times greater than their availability. That's pretty strong selection for that seral stage of forest. So let's look at some of these shrub layers? Well, in our coastal forests, if you've been to some of the places in Redwood National Park and maybe try to get off trail, it's a little difficult to walk through. It's pretty dense and continuous. It's typically dominated by things like rhododendron, salal, evergreen huckleberry, and a couple other species. Well, look, some of the diet work showed that there's value in having mass producers like evergreen huckleberry and salal, because martens eat those directly. But a lot of the key prey species like chipmunks are kind of fruit specialists and eat a lot of fruit too. So it also supports prey. And we think that there's a competitive advantage because those shrub layers are so complex that the marten's kind of the right size to move around under there and actually successfully capture prey, where larger bodied species aren't. And I'll show you some information to support that in the next.
So Keith, what is the 1 meter measurement on the right?
It just gives you sort of perspective on, how dense these areas are. And then there's the 2 meters, there's somebody standing there with a density pole. So you can kind of see just, it's dense and continuous throughout these stands that the martens are in. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about home range placement and within home range habitat use. The white dots there are all the locations where this particular female was found when we had her radio collared and we looked at what location she was using, and you can see that she's using mostly the old growth habitat and the riparian. She spent a little bit of time on the edge of the red, which is a regenerating clear cut. So really focusing that on that high quality habitat within her home range. And then if we look at across the sort of distribution of this population, if we look at patch size, the size of that old growth habitat or another type of habitat that uses serpentine, they tend to select patches that are much larger than you would expect. And if we look at the availability of patch size of suitable habitat, you can see that it declines nicely, the red bars, as you increase in size from 50 hectares to 100 to 200, all the way to greater than 300. But if you look at how the green bars, they're kind of the inverse of that. The availability is going down as patch size increase, and martens are selecting for larger patch sizes. So both the quality of individual stands and then being connected to a lot of adjacent stands of similar quality is really important for martens. And that's, again, greater than 200 hectares. That's a pretty big patch, a habitat, and that's where we see the strongest selection within this population. So I'm going to transition from now talking about the details of habitat to putting that into the framework of what's going on that's threatening this population. This is just a conceptual model, and it's just a way to organize the forthcoming information and talk about how when we modify the landscape through timber harvest practice, it has direct effects on martens through habitat change that lead to disruptions in behavior and biology. They also have indirect effects by changing the habitats of other species and changing the interactions of predators, competitors, which in turn affect martens and affect population decline. And then there's another category called stochastic things. That's things like large fires, droughts, and then there's also demographic and genetic stochasticity that are sort of really important when you have very small populations, and I will talk about where the Humboldt Marten sits. So I'm kind of going to go through the next sequences of information and start to populate this so we can start to put all of the sort of threats together on why this population has declined and what are some of the issues about that we need to clear up before it can start to expand and recover. So one thing we should know a little bit about is dispersal ecology. In the fall, right about now, is when all the young martens start ranges. This is where home ranges from animals that have died can be recolonized, or populations can start to expand along the disperse. They typically disperse quite over quite short distances. In one study, it was less than 5 kilometers on average. In another, it was up to 15 kilometers. But these long distance movements are pretty rare for martens. And if we start to look at that and how that may limit the ability for this population to, say, recolonize some of the larger patches of suitable habitat in the range, we could see that if we expect the population to be able to recolonize headwaters, that's 80 kilometers away. Humboldt Redwood State Park's over 100. Those really exceed by several times the ability for martens to actually disperse naturally. And then another thing that you know, martens aren't birds. They can't fly from one patch to the next. They have to run around on the ground and deal with the quality of the habitat and whatever is associated with that. So there was a study up in Canada that looked at more than 200 individuals and compared how they moved in logged and unlogged landscapes. And that's really an unprecedented study. Studying juvenile dispersal is pretty difficult. So a study that can get 200 and look at it is very valuable for us. And what they found is that in the log landscapes, dispersal speed and distance was reduced. And most importantly, survival to adulthood was only 25%. In the unlogged, they can move faster and farther, but most importantly, they had double the survival. So that's really important. If we zoom in closer, these black triangles are all of the kind of locations where we've detected martens over the last 10 years or so within the population. And we start to look at, well, how close are some of the other places like Jedediah Smith, Prairie Creek, Lost Man Creek? Could they recolonize those on their own? And while Jed Smith's pretty close, Prairie Creek and Lost Man are really pushing the envelope for what we might expect them to do. And then if you look at the colors, they contrast logged and unlogged forest. So to get to Jed Smith, Prairie Creek, or Lost Man Creek currently, they not only have to go pretty far for what you'd expect an average marten to go, they also have to travel through a lot of logged and degraded habitat. So again, we think that because we have not seen them recolonize these places, that this is part of the impediment to doing that. Coast. A couple other species that are potential competitors and predators for martens are actually increasing in those habitats. So here we have, in second growth redwood, we find that about 60% of our survey locations and about 50% for gray fox get detections. When we look at that in the core marten population, again, that's mostly late seral and old growth forest, we find a very low percent of either of those species. As we get out of the fog zone and go interior, where the forest is still intact, but we've now lost the shrub layer, we've got black oak and pine species coming in, different prey, we find that the fisher and gray fox in that more natural situation are detected about 50% of the sites that we look at. Of the animals die within 2 years. And that right now, preliminarily, is one of the highest, one of the lowest survival rates in the literature. So that's a major issue. All right, so if we start to plug that in back into our conceptual model here, landscape modification throughout the historical range of the Humboldt Marten, more than 90% of habitat has been changed, lost, or degraded. Remnant patches of suitable habitat are fairly isolated with respect to what martens can disperse into and find on their own. This has caused disruptions to stable occupancy in fragmented areas. We find martens show up once in a while, but they don't persist like you'd expect. It decreases their ability to disperse successfully, and of course, they lose recruits as they're trying to move through these more hazardous environments. And then the indirect effects. We now know that the distribution abundance of fishers, gray foxes, and bobcats has been elevated in response, and this has really changed some of the interactions. I think most strongly recently has been the effect of the bobcats on martens at the edge of the population. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the stochastic real quick, and then shift to some of our conservation work. So demographic stochasticity is inevitable random variation in mean and birth death rates. Maybe there's a wet year and then a dry year. Not a big deal. Most populations are adapted to deal with that. But if this is erratic over time, it can lead to declines in small populations. It's typically not a problem when you have more than 100 individuals. And as you already know, our population is less than 100. So simple things like this natural variation that you expect in the environment is a greater risk for small populations. And then again, environmental stochasticity is more of a weather-driven events or disturbances can be an issue too. And we're in a big drought pulse right now, and that's going to affect some prey populations, and that could affect what happens this year and next year in terms of reproduction and survival. But natural disturbances also are rearing their head as a major issue here for a small population. When we were doing the population resurvey in 2008, the Blue 2 fire complex blew up, and about 25% of the range was burned over. It was burned over in a mosaic, so some good, some bad. But when you have habitat that's so reduced, any loss in the short term is a pretty negative effect. The Biscuit fire that preceded this also took out some habitat in south coastal Oregon. And then if you've been following the Happy Camp complex, that's luckily east of this population, but it's so big that if that fire of that scale just got started in the middle, we could lose most of the current range if a severe fire was to go through there. So this is another thing to be concerned about. And then finally, genetic stochasticity. These are things that just happen when you have so few individuals that there tends to be inbreeding. There can be effects on fitness. I've done some calculations based on our population size to look at what we might expect to have been lost. It could be something in the order of 26 to 46% of heterozygosity, just genetic variation, which is important for keeping individuals fit genetically over time. And that may be abstract, but if you think about the Florida panther, they had a similar rate of loss of genetic variation, and they started getting deleterious effects like male testes were shrinking and they weren't having as much reproductive success. So that's something we need to look into. We have samples to be able to do that. We haven't yet, but again, that's another one of these red flags of small populations that we need to be thinking about. In the future, the way to remedy something like that, of course, is to move animals around from other populations to get the gene pool more diverse. So again, plug in the stochastic of things over here, and now we see we have really issues about landscape modification driving the situation here. We've altered some important predators and competitors in the system. And then we also, because we have a single small population, have to be really concerned about these stochastic issues. So what are we doing about it? I'm involved with a multi-agency and stakeholder group that has state, tribal, federal, NGO entities involved, and we're trying to come together to come up with a plan on how we can get this turned around. We have a draft conservation strategy that we hope to have done by this fall and start to implement some of the pieces of that. And really the conservation objectives for that are pretty basic. We need to increase the population size and increase the population distributional extent. And we recognize that this has to be an interactive process over time where we invoke demographic modeling to kind of guide what we're doing, and then implement things, identify data needs, fill those, so we're designing things better, and then monitor things over time so we can see that are the conservation actions we're actually doing, are they actually having the outcomes, positive outcomes on vital rates and abundance that we want. And that would feed back in, so we revise our plan every 5 years or so and improve it. So that sort of adaptive approach. So what are some of the short and long-term conservation actions we're looking at? Because habitat restoration takes so long in forests, I mean, we can't just create old growth overnight. We have to manage young forests, responsibly to accelerate them to get to old forest. But that's going to take even decades if we started in everywhere we thought was important today. So our short-term options are pretty limited. But what we've been doing over the last couple of years is looking at this concept of assisted dispersal. That means moving animals that are dispersing out of the edge of the core population into habitats that they're likely to survive, either to bolster the core population or to establish new populations in disjunct but currently suitable habitat, for example, in Redwood National State Parks. And then in line with that, if we're going to move animals around, we need to make sure that we have the restoration work going on so that those populations will naturally be reconnected over time. So we need to identify areas for strategic habitat restoration and implement those actions to improve and accelerate restoration of key habitat elements. And a lot of what that means is in places like Redwood National Park, maybe doing some restorative thinning in those young second growth stands to make the residual trees grow faster. If you've walked around a lot of those stands, they're so dominated by trees, the shrub cover is really reduced, so you get light to the forest floor, you get that structural complexity back. In other places that are more trying to balance timber harvest, say the Yurok tribe or Green Diamond, it might be changing some of the management and harvest techniques to be more compatible with martens where they're in very key areas. The Yurok tribe is actually looking to shift a lot of their lands to longer rotation and selective harvest, so that's really encouraging. They've also recently been purchasing portions of Green Diamond that are in really key marten areas, so there's good outlook for changing management in those areas. And then another thing that we're doing is testing the use of surrogate resting and denning structures in the short term, because a lot of these things, when we cord the trees that they select for resting, the average age was about 300 years old. So it's going to take a long time. That'll probably be one of the last pieces that comes back in to forests that we're managing for late sterile conditions. So in the short term, coming up with surrogates is probably going to be pretty important to accelerate their suitability. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our study that's now 2 years in on assisted dispersal. What we wanted to do was what we'd like to do is increase juvenile and female recruitment either into the core population or move these animals into, say, a prairie creek. So what we need to do is find a place where juvenile males and females annually disperse into and find out what their fates are. And some of the work that Green Diamond did, they started to detect martens in degraded second growth habitat in the Pequon Creek drainage over about a 5-year period. So we started to look at that in 2012. We thought that most of those animals were dispersing out from the core and showing up and probably not faring very well based on our principles of sort of marten ecology. And we sort of consider that as a potential source area. If our animals are going out there and dying, then maybe we can assist their dispersal in the places where they're likely to survive or start a new population. And what we found is about every year now, 10 new animals show up in that source area. They're almost all yearlings or 1-year-olds, what you'd expect for dispersers. And again, I've already mentioned 9 out of 23 animals have died. Actually, 10 out of 23 have died, and 9 of those were radio collared and were all killed by bobcats. So it looks like survival is very reduced in that area. So right now, the way the evidence is starting to shift towards that being a pretty viable option there, and we likely increase their survival by moving them to other places. And then where would we move them? Of course, if the core population, if that population size shows a downward trend or was too small, we could put them into places that are unoccupied. Or more importantly, when you have one population, something like a catastrophic fire is a big risk, so it would be nice to start a couple other satellite populations so we can buffer against either a large fire or something else that happens, like a disease outbreak. There are things like rabies and canine distemper that cycle through gray fox populations naturally. And then a little bit of, how would we do strategic restoration? What does that mean? Where would it go? really what we're talking about is trying to make more home ranges that can support female reproduction, the engine for population growth for this species. And then first priority sites would be places where females have bred before or occupied but are no longer occupied. This is an image of a very fragmented portion of the Goose Creek watershed where we had a couple females occupy in 2000 and actually raised kids. But in 2008 and in 2012, those have been taken over by fishers, again, that fragmented landscape. And then second priority sites would be trying to reconnect this green here so we can get more animals able to move through and reoccupy those areas. Those are kind of the two prongs of strategic restoration. And then on the ground, it would look something like this, where we have a remnant core and we identify the young patches of forest that we can thin, we can add surrogate resting structures and denning structures to hopefully accelerate their suitability and recolonization by martens. And then again, if we look at how to recreate forests for marten or late sterile forests for marten and other species, we can find things that we can do in the short term to accelerate the recruitment of large diameter trees and snags like thinning. We can also increase shrub cover within 5 to 10 years in some cases. We've already done some experiments to demonstrate that. But something that's going to take the longest, as I've already mentioned, is the growth, death, and rot processes for large resting structures. So again, something that we can do in the short term is try some of these surrogate structures. Before I get to that, this is the data on restorative thinning that has been done in Redwood National and State Parks and how shrub layers have responded. These are marten occupied sites, again the highest shrub density. These are sites, control sites of second growth that have never been thinned. And then these are the thinning, you may be familiar with the Whiskey 40 on the way up to the Bald Hills. That was an experimental thinning study. These are young plots and these are the combination of the Beers and Whiskey 40. What you can see is if you thin young stands very quickly, even within 5 years or so, you start to get shrub cover responding immediately. It's kind of a no-brainer. You give light to the forest floor and the shrubs are going to respond. And over a very short period, you start to get some stands that are getting in the range of what martens select for. And we've also now looked at the response of small mammal populations and diversity and abundance of small vertebrates is definitely positive to these thinning responses. So you're starting to build the community back faster when you do these sort of restorative thinnings in stands versus just walking away and saying, no, we'll just let it grow on its own and do its own thing. It'll probably take many, many decades to get to where the thin stands are. Okay, I'm working with a master's student at Humboldt State, Matt Delheimer, to take a concept that some British biologists developed for the European pine marten and has been successful, basically building a large nest box or rest box. That's very familiar to most of you. You think about putting out boxes for bluebirds and wood ducks, and that's worked well. So we're taking that same concept with a successful design from Europe and bringing it over here. These boxes have actually even been used as den sites with females reproducing. So working with Matt, we've now deployed 50 of these as of 2013, and we've got some use, but these things usually take time to kind of become part of the natural environment and for animals to find them and use them. So we're going to continue to monitor the success of those structures and hope that their success in Europe will be repeated here on the north coast for the Humboldt Marten. So in summary, there's a number of reasons that really are cause for concern, and we need to get on it and start taking some action. And extensive landscape modification in the Redwood region has caused a regime change in forest structure, prey dynamics, and the carnivore community composition. And coastal old growth with dense shrub cover affect the Humboldt Marten directly by providing suitable habitat to meet their life history needs, and indirectly by mediating interference competition with those larger carnivores such as bobcats, which can kill them. And then conservation actions to stabilize and increase the last remnant population in California need immediately. We have less than 100 individuals. A lot of different things could happen that could push that in the wrong direction fast. And then we need a combination, a conservation strategy that's going to have short-term and long-term actions acting synergistically, so that if we move animals, we're restoring habitat around them. So eventually, once the habitat grows back in, we'll start to reconnect populations and increase the overall distribution of limits on Humboldt Marten. And with that, that's what I have, so I can take questions.
So was the picture of the Marten that was in the nest box, was that from Europe or was that?
Yeah, that's a European fine Marten. You may notice it's a little darker, a little different looking. Yeah.
Are you finding the Humboldt Marten up in the South Fork mountain area in cahoots with Fisher, or that far east? It looked like on the updated range map they might have been up there near the borderline between the two counties.
Yeah, South Fork Mountain's really Fisher country. Yeah, that's a little bit outside of the range.
There'd be some competition there then.
But yeah,
They tried to get in there.
yeah, there's quite a few fishers there. That's where some of the telemetry works. Yes.
There are Oregon populations with the same kind of concerns?
Yeah, so I didn't talk a lot about genetics, but we recently did some phylogenetic work to look at the relationships, evolutionary relationships with martens in coastal Oregon and California. As you might imagine, there's no real biogeographical barrier that would stop martens from moving north or south across the border. And it turns out that those populations are genetically identical, so they're going to be, their taxonomy is going to be revised to be included in the Humboldt Marten. In coastal Oregon right now, we know there's two populations that are doing better than us, but those populations may be in a similar size category, and they're both disjunct from each other. So Oregon right now, we're working with them to really catch up and do a lot of survey work. Spend a lot of time this summer with a variety of groups trying to organize systematic surveys to figure out exactly how many populations and how big they are up there too.
So you potentially do have some populations that you could move some genetic diversity around, or
Yeah.
add some if you're establishing new populations.
Right. If we found out that loss of genetic diversity is a big deal, then we could start talking about moving individuals amongst. Ken?
A lot of times when people are talking about getting animals across inhospitable habitats, the concept of corridors comes up. And my recollection is that fishers use riparian corridors a lot for dispersal. Is that true of martens as well? And if so, are current riparian habitat buffer practices inadequate to create those corridors for martens?
I think the forest practice buffers are small for sort of marten space use, but the animals using more the degraded landscape definitely use riparian areas more because they tend to be more intact. That's where the larger residual structures are, and they tend to be more prey rich in general because of the presence of water. So we'd expect that martens would be attracted to riparian areas and use them more frequently. But when I talking about creating effective corridors for marten dispersal and movement, I think we're leaning more towards this sort of stepping stone concept where you can't just have a narrow corridor across the Klamath River from the core to Redwood National Park and hope animals are going to start going there all the time. I mean, maybe a couple males will, but I think we need some stepping stones of suitable female home ranges to kind of get there and make sure there's animals going back and forth. We're testing some of these concepts with 2 different modeling efforts using GIS and looking at least cost, path, and least corridor, and then also with some individual-based modeling where we actually simulate dispersing animals with a PhD student at Purdue University to really test these ideas before we start putting conservation dollars into those different ideas.
Do you know why the lifespan is so short? Is it just predation?
Yeah, I think it's the sum total of difficulties in the wild. I think captive animals have lived up to 15 years, but there's a lot of different ways in which martens can die: starvation, predation. Most wild populations, predation dominates the sort of sources of mortality. So here, again, we've kind of been pointing at bobcats, but other things kill martens, great horned owls, fishers, coyotes, things like that.
Where do we stand relative to the Martens requirements affecting logging practices?
Yeah, well, you can see that for a species that likes old forests and dense shrub cover, those are things that aren't really regenerated under most forest management regimes. So luckily, a lot of the current population is distributed on public lands, so national forest lands. And then the areas that we're targeting for population restoration are largely state and national park lands. So they're on board with, kind of the restoration. And then the Yurok tribe, which owns a lot of land right in between, where we're trying to get the populations restored, they're thinking of shifting to management that's going to be much more amenable. But the challenge will be, sitting down with Green Diamond and seeing what they are going to propose. But it's going to have to be creative. I think there may be some give and takes, and we'll see how that shakes out when they work with Fish and Wildlife Service, come up with a HCP or whatever they're going to do. Yes.
Is there a conflict between fire management, fire prevention, thinning forests for that purpose, and managing for martens?
Yeah, there are some tensions. A lot of the ideas about fire in the Redwood, I think, are mixed. There's a lot of debate about the frequency of fire, and when you talk about things like shrub cover, a lot of fields managers just see that as something that can carry a fire and want to remove it. But the ecology of our system is we're in the fog zone, and we need to keep that in mind when we talk about fire and reducing fire. And we need to be smart about where folks are proposing fuels management sort of projects, that they're not affecting really important marten areas.
What are the listings again, state and federal, on the Humboldt Marten? And could it be an avenue for improvement of management if it's changed in the near future? Or is there any hope for that?
Well, Fish and Wildlife Service can make a decision on the Humboldt Marten within the year.
Right.
Yeah, that will change things even if it just gets put on the candidate list.
How's it listed with the state?
It's not currently listed in the state. It's a species of special concern, which...
What's your feeling on that?
On what?
On the state? Should it be listed differently?
I think starting with the federal level is probably the way to go. Probably an outside party that would petition at the state level, but
Yeah.
it would be hard to not list it. There's a new mammals species of special concern book coming out. They're really changing the approach at the state level. They now have a ranking system for all species of special concern, and the Humboldt Marten ranks Humboldt. I think it's within the top 5 mammals in California, so that's already been helping with getting funds moving and getting folks at the state level really focused on this issue.